This episode is brought to you by HASA. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the Bottom Feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about the Intermatic mechanical timers. You're going to be familiar with these if you do pool service, and these are the most prevalent timers out there in the pool industry today. A lot of backyard pools will have this timer still on the pool equipment pad. Even if they have a variable speed pump, the timer will still be in existence. I'll go over some of the ins and outs of these timers, troubleshooting, and tips. Are you a pool service pro looking to take your business to the next level? Join the Pool Guy coaching program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support from me. I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. And if you're an old timer like me, or if you have pools that are pretty old, you may see the Paragon timers. These are very similar to the Intermatic timers, except the dial is red and white, and these were very common back in the 80s and 90s, but they've been phased out. A lot of the parts you can't even purchase anymore, so once these die, you have to replace it with maybe an Intermatic timer. And there was a run of these really small little timing mechanisms back in the day also. Can't remember the brand of them. You probably won't run into it, so I don't think I'll mention it here, but you may run into a Paragon timer out there. It's not the same as an Intermatic timer. The components are different, so just be aware of that. But Intermatic timers are just everywhere out there, and they're used even, again, what I mentioned at the beginning, when you have a VS pump. Most installers will leave the timer there because it's a lot easier than rewiring everything and putting a junction box. They'll just use the timer and wire the standalone VS pump directly to it. There's really nothing wrong with doing that. The only caveat to that is that you're going to have to take off the on-off trippers and leave that mechanical timer on the on position all the time. Otherwise, if you don't do that, and you may run into this where someone installed it, they didn't bother to take off the on-off trippers, what's going to happen is that the Intermatic timer is controlling the standalone VS pump at that point. So if you just have the timer and you leave it on without the on-off trippers, it's almost like a pass-through kind of thing at that point. But once you turn that timer off or put the on-off trippers on there, it'll actually supersede the VS pump because it's wired into that timer, if that makes sense. So just be aware that a lot of installers will leave that timer there, and it's something that is just done in the industry because it's a lot less work. You're just using the existing connectors that were the original single speed pump. You're putting the VS pump there. Sometimes you're going to see a timer there also with the VS pump, but that timer is actually controlling a booster pump for maybe a Polaris cleaner or something else, or the salt cell. And you're going to have that timer set specifically to run in conjunction with the variable speed pump schedule. For example, some VS pumps will have auxiliary relays on the back, and you can connect a Polaris cleaner or a salt cell to the back of it, but a lot of them don't, and a lot of the older VS pumps don't have this option. And so there's going to be a separate Intermatic timer that controls the booster pump for the Polaris or the salt cell, and you have to set that timer accordingly to when the VS pump is running on the schedule at the speed that's required to power that. So for instance, I'll give you this example. Let's say you have a IntelliFlow pump and it comes on at 8 a.m. till 2 p.m. on low speed, 1700 RPMs. And then from 2 p.m. to 8 o'clock at night, it comes on a medium speed of 2600 RPMs. So during that period from 2 p.m. on until it turns off, you can set that booster pump timer for the Polaris, let's say, for a 2-hour period. Let's say you want to put it on at 3 and turn it off at 5 o'clock. And that way, when the VS pump is running on a schedule, that booster pump will come on and it'll power the Polaris while that pump is running. Otherwise, it's not going to work because, as you know, for the Polaris cleaner to work, the pressure side cleaner has to have the main pump running. Same with the salt cell. A lot of times, the salt system has a timer and it has to be set. And the Pool Guy Podcast Show has teamed up with UPA to bring you affordable, reliable liability insurance starting at just $64 a month. Get up to $2 million in coverage, and the members of my coaching group get an even lower rate. Protect your business and your peace of mind. Sign up with UPA today by clicking the link in the podcast description. The VS pump. Now, where you run into a problem is when the power goes off in the area. Now, the VS pump will have a backup battery, and it'll actually save the program time. As long as it's not a long period of time with the power off, it's going to save that schedule. So that'll come back on, no problem, when the power comes back on. But if the power's off for like 3 or 4 hours, what happens is that Intermatic timer is kind of messed up as far as what time is going to come on, because there's no actual way for that to stop or reset itself. And basically, if the power goes off at 3 o'clock and it comes back on at 6, you've lost 3 hours on that timer. And so now the timer is going to come on later in the day because of the power outage, if that makes sense. You have to actually manually reset the automatic timer once the power goes off. So let me talk about the timer mechanism now that I've covered kind of some things that you run into that are pretty common out there. The mechanism itself is pretty simple. There's a clock face that's yellow, and to set it or turn it, you just kind of put your hands on it, pull it out towards you, and then you can turn it left or right, and then you release it and it should snap back in. The only time you wouldn't be able to pull the face out and turn it is if the on-off trippers are pretty close to coming on. At that point, you have to kind of move it, and then you can pull it out and twist it and set it. So you can't drop it back in if the on-off trippers are nearby where you're dropping it back down into. You'll figure that out when you're doing it out in the field. It's pretty basic. There are basically 2 of these timers out there. There's several different ones, but the 2 main ones you're going to run into are the T101, which is the 120 volt timer mechanism, and the T104, which is a 240 volt mechanism. Now, there is a difference. The voltage, of course, is a difference, and how many connectors on these timers also. So for a 240 volt timer, you're going to have a double breaker. Usually you can tell by looking at the breaker if the pool equipment is on a double breaker, which is one large breaker and one, if you open up the panel, you'll see one large breaker, which is 2 prongs connected together, and that's a 220 volt breaker. If you open up the panel and the pool pump's on a single prong, then that's a 120 volt breaker. And you can also tell by the horsepower of the pump usually. If you have a 1.5 or 2 horsepower or 2.5 horsepower single speed pump, it's going to be on a 240 volt breaker automatically, because it really can't power. You can't power that horsepower above 1 horsepower usually with a breaker that's not 240 volts because of the amperage of that pump, or the motor, I should say. So you can also tell if it's going to be a 110 or 240 volt timer based on the horsepower of the pump. If it's 1 horsepower or less, typically that's going to be on 120 volt, although there are some 1 horsepower pumps that are connected to 240 volts, so that's not actually something that you can know for a fact if it's a 1 horsepower pump. But anything over 1.5 horsepower or above typically is going to be on a 240 volt panel, which means that the timer is going to be a T104. You can also tell by how many wires are connected to it, because you can connect more to the T104 than the T101. I say all this because when you go to replace the timer, let's say the mechanism dies, and it does die over time, you're going to have to replace it with the same mechanism. There's a few oddball ones out there that don't really match the T101 or T104. There's like a T103. what I would suggest you do if you're going to replace this, I have 2 videos on this, one for 110 volt, one for 240 volt. And what you want to do is mark the wires with some tape. Of course, turn off the breaker, mark the wires before you disconnect them. Then you want to disconnect them, and then when you pull out that mechanism, it just unsnaps from the box. Look at the back of the mechanism, and there'll be the model number on the back of it. This is kind of important if you have an odd Intermatic timer, because you want to get the same model number. That way you can wire it exactly the same way without having to think too much about where the wires go. It's much easier to replace these when you can actually use the same exact model number and connect the wires exactly to where they were on the old one. So look at the back of the timer. There's going to be a model number printed on there, and you want to get that model number. You can't use a 110 volt version, 120 volt version, and a 240 volt setup, and you can't use a 240 volt T104 and 120 volt setup. So just keep that in mind, that the voltage of the timers are specific for the equipment pad, and that'll save you a lot of problems later. You may want to carry one of each of these in your truck so that if you do run into a problem where the timer is not working, then you can replace it. Now, on the timer itself, if you look at it directly at eye level, like kind of bend down a little bit, look at eye level, there's actually a little tiny sight area in there where you can see the gear in the back turning. Now you're going to hear it ticking, so it's going to be ticking pretty audibly. Some actually are louder than others. I think when they get older, they get really loud. So you're going to hear it ticking. You're going to hear tick, 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 something like that. I probably did a terrible sound effect, but you get the idea that it's ticking. Now, if it's not ticking, you can look through that sight glass or the sight window. It's not a glass. It's like a little hole in the metal or the aluminum, and you can see the gear back there if you look carefully. And you should be able to see the gear turning like a watch. If you ever took a watch apart, or if you had a grandfather clock, you can see the gears. Same thing. Look through that little sight hole, and you can see the gear turning or not. Now, if it's not turning, there's a good chance that the motor is burned out. Of course, you want to check the voltage to make sure that there's actually power getting to the timer. And if there's no power getting to the timer, there may be a number of reasons why this is happening. The breaker may have tripped, so go to the breaker panel and flip it off and on, see if that turns it back on. That does happen once in a while, where the breaker trips and you have to reset it. It may be that the time clock is just dead, which means the motor is no longer functioning. Now you can change the motor, but the mechanisms are so inexpensive, and usually when the motor goes out, it's indication that it's a pretty old timer. So I would just replace the whole timer itself. Sometimes that dial mechanism doesn't lock in the place anymore, and that's also a reason to replace it. I really don't replace components. The only components I replace are the on-off trippers. I'll go over that in a minute. But basically, if the motor goes out, or if you can't get that dial to lock in or snap back in, just replace the whole mechanism at that point. It's much easier, and that's just an indication that that timer has gotten older. Again, they just kind of clip out of the box, so it's really easy to replace them. It's not rocket science if you mark the wires. You don't want to take the wires off and take it off without marking them, because then you may have trouble rewiring it, unless you are an electrician or have a lot of background in using, in wiring things. You're going to be confused. So make sure you mark those wires before you take the mechanism off completely. A few things that can go wrong with these. Again, mechanical stuff like it not working. That's typical when it gets older. But the on-off trippers are really the key to these things. So the on-off trippers, if you look at them carefully, you take a pair of them and look, you'll see like there's little notches in them. And the notches are actually opposite each other. So the on tripper will actually turn the time clock on, and then the off tripper will turn the time clock off. And this is really important because one or the other could be causing a problem. Let's say that you get to the pool and you notice that it's not running all week long. And that's typically because the on tripper is not activating. Sometimes it gets slightly bent. It has to be almost perfect for that mechanism to click it on. And so if you take off the on tripper and look at it carefully. See if there's like a little bend in it. If there's a little bend in that notch, throw it away, put a new one on there. And that usually solves the problem. They do get damaged over time and they warp a little bit, and it has to be, again, pretty perfect for it to work. So replace that on tripper. Now, if you get to a pool and it's running continuously, more than likely the off tripper is defective. Sometimes the off tripper slides down to where the on tripper is at and it's loose and it's not even activating the off position. Now you have to kind of play with this and make sure they're on really tight. So I make sure I tighten them really good. Hand tight is fine usually. There are some older ones I've run into where I have to use like a little wrench to tighten them up really good. But as long as they're on there tight, they're not going to move. And the main thing that you're going to run into is these things get a little bit loose over time, or they warp and they don't work. And so carry, of course, a set of these. Now, your supplier may sell a set that comes with like a green tripper in there as well. I never really use that. I think it's for an older system. They keep it in the pack. I'm sure Intermatic still sells it that way, but if there's an extra tripper that's kind of green in color, I just don't use that one. I think it's mainly for an older Intermatic timer, and they may have just got rid of that, but I know that there are some sets with that one. But you can buy a set of 4 on-off trippers, or 2 on-off trippers, I should say, in each one, and you can use that and replace them when you need to. And that solves a lot of the problems with these Intermatic timers. They're really pretty bulletproof, and the biggest problem you're going to have, again, is with the on-off trippers not activating, turning it on or turning it off. You can also set multiple runtimes on these things if you wanted to. Some customers like that. They like having the spillway come on at nighttime when they're home eating dinner. So you can actually put an extra set of on-off trippers from 6 to 8 p.m. to have it run. And it'll run every day at that time, and you can have another set coming on from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. It is something that you can do also. It's not necessary, but a lot of people do like having more than one time on these things, and it's something that is a possibility. Again, if you have a variable speed pump connected to it, just make sure that you have it on the on position and that you have the on-off trippers off. That way it doesn't bypass the variable speed pump or doesn't supersede the programming by turning off sometime during the day. I would also show the customer how this operates. So in case they want to turn their pool on, you can override this timer. So if the pool is off at the time, let's say that the time is set to come on from 8 to 4 and it turns off and the customer wants to use their spa at 6 o'clock, you can show them how to bypass the timer by simply flipping it to on. There's like a little notch, to push it to the right, it'll turn the timer on. And then, of course, it's going to continue running all the way until it turns off again, which will be almost 24 hours, or in some cases 22 hours or 20 hours, depending on when they turn it on. Let the customer know just to turn that off when they're done. And it's a pretty simple procedure. And make sure you have the shield over the wires. It's really important to have that on there, especially for customers that are going to use it and turn it on and off, but for yourself as well. With those exposed wires, you can touch one of those wires with your hands, especially if they're somewhat wet, and you can get a nice jolt of electricity. It's going to go up your arm into your elbow, and it's going to be like hurting your arm for most of the day with a jolt like that. And if for some reason the equipment's not grounded and you're standing in a puddle of water and you're not wearing work boots, maybe you're wearing flip-flops, you can probably get electrocuted pretty badly in that case. So make sure that shield is on there, and make sure you don't touch those screws that are on the Intermatic timer itself, because they're always going to be hot or live, and you touch those, you're going to get shocked. It doesn't turn off the power to them when it turns off the mechanism, so just be aware of that. And when you're going to change the wires, turn off the breaker, because again, those wires are hot and they're going to be on all the time until you turn the breaker off. And one last tip, if you're going to clean filters and you have an Intermatic timer, a lot of times it's going to be really close to the on time. So what you want to do is pull the dial out towards you and then flip it really far away from that on tripper, clean the filter, and then reset it, flip it back to the time. And again, these don't reset with daylight savings either, so you have to do that manually, or power outage, you have to do that as well. But I would say when you're cleaning a filter, make sure you're far away from that on tripper, or turn the breaker off. Sometimes there's a sub panel right there, and it's safer to turn it off because you don't want that coming on when you're taking that filter lid off, because that's potentially the danger point, or putting it on. That's where you can really have a fatal accident at that point while you're cleaning the filter. They're basic, they're good, they're out there, they're all over the place, and you'll learn how to use these Intermatic timers over time. And I like them. I think they're a great way to control the pool. And out of all the mechanical timers, I think Intermatic are the best. If you're looking for other podcasts, you can find those on my website, swimmingprolearning.com. There's a podcast icon on the homepage. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel Monday through Friday. I'll post a podcast there. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week. God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.